the Zoom meeting. So again, if you could, please set up your desktop the way that you see mine here. So one window should be Canvas and a second window should be Zoom. So you're going to want to make your Zoom meeting small, about halfway of your screen, half of your screen, and then your Canvas the other half. All right. So I'm going to give you a minute to get yourself set up, and then we're going to go ahead and get started. So again, please use this time to set up your desktop the way that you see mine, with half of your screen being your Canvas window and the other half of your screen being your Zoom meeting. So I'm going to resume in about 1 minute. Please make sure that you have your desktop set up the way that you see mine here, and then today will be easier for you. All right. Hold on 1 sec. So what you're doing right now is you're setting up your desktop so that we can get started. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and move on. What you should see on your agenda there is you should see that we are kind of moving away from the colonies specific conversation and talking about the American Revolution. So Jesse, please turn your camera on. In a second, I'll tell you guys that you can have your cameras off, but for right now, please turn them on. Okay, so again, if your camera's not on, I'm going to assume that you left, Valerie and Jesse, and I'll send you back. Jesse, I see that you have it now. And I'll send you back into the waiting room. So again, please make sure that your camera is on for this conversation. Thanks, Valerie. I'll tell you to turn it off in just a second. All right. So what I would like for you to do, and we'll revisit these KUDs in a moment, what I'd like for you to do is to please go to your Canvas window. And at the top of your Canvas window, let me put this in student view for you. At the top of your Canvas window, you see that we have Assignments List Unit 1. So this should look kind of familiar to you. For our exploration and colonization, you had a list of links for each of the assignments. Now we are moving on to the American Revolution. So if you could click on the word here, please. And it's going to take you to our assignments list. Now, the assignment number 2 listed here, the reading for 5.1, is not alive. So please don't worry about that. We're focused on number 1, which is these closed notes. Okay. So today, again, you need to be present in Zoom today in order to get credit for this assignment. All right. So if you are lost or you get kicked out or whatever, where you see the lecture video highlighted in yellow, that will be up later. Okay. So again, at the end of the day today, I'll post the lecture video. If you missed anything, if you got kicked out, if you're having trouble accessing the document, please watch that so that you can turn in your document and get credit for today. All right. So at the bottom, yours looks different from mine, but you should have a file that opens up to a document that looks like this. Okay, so what you are going to be doing today is, as I am giving you lecture, you are going to be taking notes on here. So rather than giving you or telling you to get a piece of paper and a pencil, you are going to be taking notes directly on this document page. Okay, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to check, make sure you did it, and then give it back to you so you have it to study for a test. Okay, so again, you're not writing down notes today. Today you are taking your notes directly on this document, and you're just filling in the blanks as they show up on the screen. So for example, our lecture KUDs are know, understand, do. Our know, why was there a blank blank? Well, in our lecture, you'll learn that why was there an American Revolution? So on that first line, I'm going to double tap on the red and type American. And then double tap on the second line and type Revolution. Okay, so again, that's how you're going to be taking notes today. I'm going to give you lecture, and then while I'm lecturing, you're just filling in the blanks. Double click on the red line and just start typing. So that is your task for today. Again, at this point, you may turn off your camera, but do not leave the Zoom. Please stay in the Zoom so that you can take your closed notes with the rest of us. All right. And I'm going to get started in about 30 seconds. Again, cameras can be off, but please make sure that you are here, that you are present, and that you are doing the work, because you're turning it in at the end of the class period today. All right. So let's move on to our lecture. Okay, so I'm going to move back one. So we're talking today about the Great Awakening and Enlightenment. So these were two movements that occurred in the American colonies and are going to be a huge push for the American Revolution and the eventual end of our relationship with the British government. Okay, so these are two super important movements that you need to know and understand. All right, so hopefully by the end of this unit, you'll be able to answer this question: why was there an American Revolution? Okay, why did this even happen in the first place? So today and tomorrow, I want you to understand that the Great Awakening influenced these ideas of revolution, of making a change to the government because the government isn't working for you anymore. But also, the Great Awakening really expressed ideas of morality, of doing what's right for the greater good. Okay. The Enlightenment, on the other hand, it was more about thinking, and it introduced ideas about government itself, that the government should have a constitution. It should have a list of rules that everyone is expected to follow. Okay. But also self-government, right? This idea that it's a government for the people and by the people, so it should be working with the people. Okay. So to do this today, we're going to have a discussion. If you have questions, please type them in the chat. I want to see your questions, but also follow along with me so you can complete those closed notes. All right. So our discussion is going to be on about how the Great Awakening and the Enlightenment influenced colonists and their ideas about British rule, which is eventually going to lead to the Stamp Act, the Boston Tea Party, the Boston Massacre, all of these things that will get us to the American Revolution. All right. So if you're typing right now, I'm going to give you about 30 seconds and then I'm going to move on. Again, your cameras can be off, but you should be in the Zoom. And if you have any questions, type them in the chat. Okay, I'm going to move on in 5. I'm going to move on in 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay. So kind of an overview. We have these two movements in the colonies, the Great Awakening and the Enlightenment. So we're going to look first at the Great Awakening. And some things to know about that before we begin. The Great Awakening was a religious movement. It was based on the Bible and the idea of a higher power and God and Jesus. So the Great Awakening was a religious movement. Okay. It really expressed the ideas of the individual, the person, above the church. So the church doesn't have authority over the people. The individual is more important. Okay. And in being a religious movement, how does it relate to a political movement? Well, because they use scripture, they use the Bible to support these ideas of resisting authority, like the church, like the British monarchy. So they were able to support the colonists who wanted to break away from the British by offering them biblical scripture or words from the Bible that supported what they were doing. Okay, so in short, the big idea is that the Great Awakening created this nationwide movement. So the nation was just the 13 colonies, but a nationwide movement that brought together American society. It bound them together and taught them to resist any threat to democracy. Okay, the idea that government works for the people, not the other way around. So I'm going to give you a moment to work on your close. I will take it into consideration, Jason, for sure. I'm going to make a note of it right now. Okay, moving on to the Enlightenment. Okay, so the Enlightenment was opposite of religion. It was about a way of thinking. So it used a lot of scientific ideas. Okay, so it was a philosophy, the way that you think about things. Okay, under the Enlightenment, this idea of natural rights as humans was born. So you as a human were born with rights to life, liberty, and property. This is an idea that came out of the Enlightenment and Enlightenment thinkers like Montesquieu, who we're going to talk about today. Okay. Government is for the people. That was an Enlightenment idea. Okay, the people don't work for the government works for the people. The government protects the natural rights of the people. This is an Enlightenment idea that today in 2020 we have strong belief in as well. Okay, so in short, under the Enlightenment, those thinkers awakened American colonists to the idea that they have liberty and rights, and that it should be a democratic government. Okay, a government where it's for the people, by the people. I'm going to stay on this slide for about 30 seconds. Okay, moving on. We're going to focus first on the Great Awakening. Okay, so here you have in front of you the 13 colonies, and looking at the key shows you where the religion was within the 13 colonies. Okay, so you can see that the majority, which are those blocks of color, those 4 blocks of color up at the top here, the majority were Christian religions. And the Great Awakening began in these northern New England colonies, where it was a congregational religion, where people went to a church and listened to a sermon. So the Great Awakening started in the New England colonies, in the northern colonies. Sorry. Okay. These people were very religious, mostly because these colonies in the north were established as places of worship. They were places where people went to practice their religion freely, mostly Christianity. You can see that there were a few Roman Catholics, there were a few Jewish groups, a couple Baptists, but for the most part, it was Christian religions in the north. Okay. But over time, interest in religion started to fall. Okay. People started to lose interest in going to church, in listening to sermons, mostly because they thought they were boring. They were dull. It was the same thing every single time. And so they lost interest in it, just like anybody would, right? The preachers started to get upset because the preachers were seeing that their followers were no longer in fear of God. They couldn't use that as a way to keep them in control, right? So they no longer had a fear of going to hell. They no longer feared that if they sinned, that God would be upset, because they didn't really have an interest in the religion in the first place. So this was kind of like what really set the stage for preachers to come in and start to change the way sermons were and get people back into church. Okay. I'm going to move on in 10 seconds. Again, if you have any questions or comments, put them in the chat, please. I'm going to move on. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So the first guy we're going to talk about is Jonathan Edwards, and he's sort of creeping in there a little bit. Jonathan Edwards was a preacher in Northampton, Massachusetts. Okay. This is going to seem strange when you hear what one of his most famous sermons was called, but what Jonathan Edwards did was he really planted joy in his followers. So most of his sermons were about being happy and finding happiness. And happiness comes in living your life to its fullest every single day, right? So he was this amazing preacher who really brought joy to his followers. That said, his most famous sermon is called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. And this sermon that he preached in his church in Massachusetts really scared followers back into believing in Jesus, because they were fearful of an angry God. Okay. Now, the thing about Jonathan Edwards is he stayed in Northampton. So rather than travel out into the colonies and spread his sermons, instead of sharing his sermons out in the colonists came to him. So they would hear from family and friends that there was this amazing preacher in Northampton, Massachusetts, that was both bringing joy and fear to his followers, and they wanted to see him. They wanted to know what was going on. So they would come to him. Okay. Now, on the other end, we have our next guy that we're going to talk about. And George Whitefield was kind of the opposite. He didn't stay in one place. Instead, he was a traveling preacher. So George Whitefield was kind of this goofy looking guy. Okay. He had an eye that freaked people out, but he had a voice that literally brought his followers to their knees, right? So he was this traveling preacher. He went up and down the East Coast of the colonies, and he would preach to everyone, and they would come to hear him speak because he was such an engaging speaker. They wanted to hear what he had to say, right? So they would come and travel to wherever he was. They would follow him all up and down the coast to listen to his sermons. And oftentimes his followers were overtaken by what he was saying. So you see these, like on TV shows or documentaries or movies, there's a preacher standing on the stage or at the pulpit, and the followers are like, swaying back and forth, hands in the air. Some are speaking in tongues, some are dropping to their knees. That was the followers of George Whitefield. Okay, they were so into what he was saying that they could feel it. They felt like, okay. So these two people combined together, the one preacher, John Edwards, who really brought both joy and fear, and then this guy who was so engaging and people just hung on to his every word. This is what helped to spread the Great Awakening movement. People like these two gentlemen, these two preachers, okay? So the big ideas about the Great Awakening that you should know is that it was a small period of time. The first Great Awakening, there were 4 of them. So the first Great Awakening was in 1730 to 1740, about 10 years. Okay, and again, there are 4, but we're only focused on one. Okay. It was the first time that the American people really came together. So it was a mass movement. They came together to listen to the words of these preachers, okay, and come together to use those words to fight against the government, what they didn't see was right. Okay, so before this happened, there was like this whole colonial culture, right? Where each colony had its own desires and its own goals. But what the Great Awakening did was it unified them. It brought them back together. So these preachers, like Edwards and like Whitefield, they brought people together as one because they all shared this experience of listening to these sermons, and they found an identity in it. It was something that they had in common. So whereas before they were broken apart, now they were coming together. Okay. And what these preachers did was they used the Bible, they used scripture to encourage the colonists to resist the things that were going on around them. So here's an example. Okay. In the Bible, one of the scriptures teaches you that if you are not wealthy, if you don't have money, that doesn't matter to God. Okay. You're no less favorable to God just because you're not a wealthy person. So the colonists listened to this and they started to realize that the Bible was supporting them to go against these wealthy colonials, so the rich, okay, and question their authority. Start to say, wait a second, what you're doing isn't right. And just because you have money, that doesn't mean that you have the power. I have power too as a person. Okay. God gives me power as a human. You don't have power over me just because you have money. We're all equal. And if you're going to treat me as less because I don't have money, then I'm going to do something to change it. Okay. So again, these preachers like Edwards and Whitefield, they really helped ignite a fire in the colonists to fight against the things that they didn't think were right. And they used the Bible to do that. I'm going to pause here for about a minute while people are catching up. If at anytime you have a question or a comment, just write it in the chat. About 20 seconds, and I'm going to move on. I'm going to move on. Okay, so let's look now at the Enlightenment. Okay. So the Enlightenment, one of their main leaders was this guy, John Locke, right? And if you've ever watched that show, Lost, which is kind of an old show, but people like old shows, there's a character on it named John Locke, and he's based on this guy, John Locke, from the 1700s. Okay. And John Locke introduced the idea of natural rights. So all humans, just by being born, have a right to life, liberty, and property. Okay. So just by being born, you have a right to these things. Okay. And he challenged the idea that kings had a God-given right to rule. So prior to this, kings found their power from the church. John Locke went against that. He said, just because you were born doesn't mean that you are better and you have a right to rule over the rest of us. Okay, God doesn't give you that right. All right. So John Locke was a huge figure, particularly in this idea that all humans, all of us, have a right to life, liberty, and property. Now, the next guy I'm going to talk about, Montesquieu, who I brought up earlier, he introduced some ideas that we've talked about already in class. Okay, so here's Montesquieu. Charles Louis Montesquieu. Okay, from early 1700s, and he introduced the idea of separation of powers. The idea that government should be separated into 3 branches. That should sound familiar. And the idea that each branch can check the other one. So here we have something that in 2020 has become a huge issue on whether or not the branches of government are doing what they can to keep each other in check, to make sure that power is separated between those 3 branches appropriately. So this is something that we've already talked about because it's an issue today, right? So this is something that we have to live with however many years later, 300 plus years later. So this was something that was brought up during the Enlightenment period. Okay. The Enlightenment period, some big ideas about that, is that it began in Britain, in Europe, in the 1750s. So a little bit after the first Great Awakening, kind of moving into the second. Okay. So in the 1750s, Europe saw this movement called the Age of Reason. Okay. It's called reason because it has to do with thinking. It's not about religion right now. Right now, it's about scientific thought. And these ideas came from Europe to the colonists by print, by pamphlets. So these ideas would come and they would be printed, and then on a ship, they would be sent over to the colonists and distributed. Ideas would come by ship through the people, and then a printing press would print these pamphlets out for the colonists. So this was one of the first ideas of ideas being spread through print. Okay. So again, it's a way of thinking versus religious faith. So kind of turning away from the religious idea and moving towards the scientific one, the way that we think about things. Okay. And just because it looks like it's not about religion, that doesn't mean that Enlightenment thinkers, scientific thinkers, were not religious. So for example, Galileo, who discovered that no, the planets don't revolve around Earth, the planets revolve around the sun. He was a very religious man, but he was also a scientist. So you can be the 2 things at once. And so he came up with this idea, he shared it, and then he was thrown in jail for the rest of his life because of it. Okay. So you can have religious thoughts, you can be a religious person, you can have faith, but you can still believe in science. And that's what enlightenment was about believing in science. Okay? So scientists discovered that natural laws govern the universe. It's not God. It's not a higher power that controls the universe. It's science. Okay. And again, they could still believe in a higher power, but there are scientific ideas that make the universe work on a daily basis. Okay. Rational thinking things through with steps, was more important than some kind of spiritual revelation. Some idea that God told you this happened, a higher power told you this is the reason why these things are occurring. That's not the case in the Enlightenment. In the Enlightenment, it's about thinking things through on a rational, scientific level. Okay? Things happen for a reason, not just because. And that reason is based in science. Okay? Now, under the Enlightenment, this, again, like Montesquieu, governments are meant to protect the natural laws of the people. Okay? That's what a government is for. A government is for the people. Okay? So the people can change a government that isn't working anymore. So if the government is failing, the people are allowed to change it. And how do we change it? We've talked about this before. We change by voting, right? Yes, we resist. Yes, we have marches. Yes, we protest. But at the end of the day, we also vote so that when the government is failing us, we do what we can to change it. Okay? And it made them start to question, does the British government protect our rights and freedoms? So as colonists, this question started to become planted in their head, and that was going to be what pushed them to start the steps of the American Revolution. I'm going to move on in about 30 seconds. Maybe about a minute. This one's a little bit longer. "15 seconds. I'm going to move on. I'm going to move on in 5. Thank you for letting me know, Umberto. All right, so moving on, we're almost done here. So together, these two movements, the Great Awakening, that religious movement, and the Enlightenment, influenced the colonists and how they felt about being ruled by the British monarchy. Okay? So colonists started to recognize and notice when there were violations against their natural rights. So when their rights to life, liberty, and property start to become violated by the British monarchy, the colonists stop letting it go. Okay, they start to notice those things. Okay, and this is going to lead to an increasing number of rebellions against these violations. So just like you're seeing today, this is like alive and well breathing history that you are in right now, right? You hear about it on the news. You see it on your social media. People are upset with the way the government is run right now. And so they're starting to rebel, right? Since for a very long time, this has been happening, but particularly in the last 6 months or so, you're seeing these rebellions. You're seeing people protest every single night in Seattle and in Atlanta and in other states across the country because they're unhappy with the way that their government is being run and they want to change it. Okay. Now, taking it back to the 1700s, we had this event called an impressment, right? And this was something that the British government was doing to colonial men. And impressment is when they would seize men, so men who were living along the eastern coast of the colonies, they were being taken against their will, and they were being forced to serve in the Royal Navy. And living on these ships was incredibly dangerous, not just because of battle, not just because there was disease all over these ships, but also there wasn't proper nutrition. They weren't being fed, right? So they were dying from being in battle. They were dying from the diseases that they couldn't get better from. They were dying because they weren't being fed properly. So they didn't want to participate in this. And it was for the British. It wasn't for us. An example of that would be King George's War in 1747. And King George sent his navy over, and as it was going over, there were naval officers who would leave and they would never return. So King George said, okay, fine, start seizing the colonial men in port along the seacoast, okay, and we'll have them serve. And the colonial men were like, oh no, wait a second, that's not going to happen. And that led to 3 days of rioting because King George was trying to take over the colonial men and they weren't going to have it. Okay. So again, this is something that happened in 1747 where the colonial citizens were fed up with what the British government was trying to do. And so they spoke out by rioting. No different than what's happening right now, right? People are upset with the way that the government is being run. And so what are they doing? They're rebelling. They're protesting. Some of them are rioting. Okay. So again, this is an idea that it's not a new idea. This is something that has been happening for hundreds of years. And if you want to enact any kind of change, you need to speak up. And what the Great Awakening and the Enlightenment did was it empowered the colonists to speak up, to not allow Britain to have all of the control anymore, to let them know that they weren't happy with the way that Britain was treating them. Okay. So that's the end of our lecture for today. All right. You should have your notes filled in. And once they are filled in, please submit them onto Canvas. So that's how you're going to get credit for today, is by submitting your work onto Canvas. If you missed any notes or anything, this lecture will be up on Canvas at the end of the day today, so you can kind of go through it and get what you may have missed and then turn it in again later. So if you've been getting kicked out or whatever and you need that extra time, this will be posted at the end of the day and you'll have the opportunity to fill in any blanks that you may not have gotten through the lecture today. Okay, so if you are done, if you are ready, excuse me, please submit it on Canvas. That is your credit for today. It is worth points. It is going in the grade book, so please get that done. Other than that, there's no attendance too. I'm going to assume that you took your notes like you were supposed to, and I'll see you tomorrow. Again, tomorrow, minimum day, so I will see you tomorrow at 10:40. All right? See you tomorrow at 10:40. Bye, Ash. See you later. Jason, it's going to be up at probably lunchtime. Bye, Samantha. Bye, Martha. Have a good day.